Hi, everyone. So please take your seats. We're about to start with the first keynote of the conference. So good afternoon from Chicago, and thank you all who are joining us online and here in person. My name is Filippo Lancieri, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at ETH Zurich and a research fellow here at the Stigler Center. And this afternoon, we are very happy to host a keynote with Professor Randal Picker on the quest for next, how antitrust shapes competition and innovation in computer and chips, in conversation with Tim Moore. Before I begin, remember that you're on the record, and we're going to post this movie on our YouTube channel afterwards. And as usual, the views of Randy and Tim are not those of the University of Chicago. We hope that you're going to join us for more events online, so check our website and also check promarket.org and the Capitalism podcast, which are part of the Stigler Center. Now let me quickly introduce our speakers. So Randal Picker is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. And other than being a great PhD supervisor, he also receives his BA, his MA, and his JD from the University of Chicago, and was associate editor of the University of Chicago Law Review. His teaching focuses on antitrust law, intellectual property law, competition policy, and regulated industries. And he's a author of the forthcoming book, The Quest for Next, which is this keynote is going to be derived from. Tim Wu is the Julius Silver Professor of Law, Science, and Technology at Columbia University. He just recently served as the White House's Special Assistant to the President for Technology Policy and Competition from 2021 to 2023, among many other public positions. And he also teaches and writes on power, antitrust, and the growing power of big tech platforms. He is the author of The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Guided Age. So without taking much of your time, Randy, the floor is all yours. We're very happy to host you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, good. Thanks for the invitation. What a great setting. I really appreciate the chance to talk. Tim and I are old friends. We taught a seminar together years ago. I teach a seminar with Tim every year if I could. Thrilled to have this chance to do this with Tim. When I agreed to do the talk, I wasn't quite sure what the conference was going to be. I knew we were going to chase Chad's question. And then I saw the agenda, and my reaction was, oh my God, they're going to have said already everything I want to say. So that made me a little nervous. But now I think where we are is there will be a nice mix of agreement and disagreement, and then we can try to sort that out. So, the how to run at Chad's question, I think there are a couple ways to run at Chad's question. So one way is hardcore empiricism, the type of things that Tommaso was talking about on the first panel. Simca was here. Is Simca still here? Simca's still here. The kind of work Simca does and others, that's not my comparative advantage at all. So I won't try to go down that path. The other one, and the first panel surfaced this nicely, is to focus on the technologies that produce growth. Right? So this GPT technology, what I now call the old GPT, since we've got a new GPT in town, those technologies are the places that growth, enormous growth occurs in the economy. That's a rich, complex literature. Chad has participated in that literature. And so looking at how antitrust might shape those technologies strikes me as a sensible path for us to pursue. And that's what I think we're doing with regard to these case studies in the morning and then the rest of the afternoon. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to participate in that. You know, if you look at these companies that we're talking about over time, they have at various points in time been the most valuable companies in the United States or in the world. So again, if we want to see where the money is, we want to see where value is getting created, these seem to be the right companies to look at. So this, as you can see, goes back to IBM and AT&T in 1982. If you go to the current era, the dominance of the tech firms, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Apple, Alphabet, keep going down that list. These are the firms that are the most valuable firms on the planet. So understanding those firms and understanding the technology associated with them, and then how antitrust might play into that, that's a great topic, and that's why we're here. All right, I want to go back to transistors. So we heard about transistors on both panels this morning. I think that's a richer story than we've seen so far. So here's where we start. So as was mentioned, two Bell Labs researchers, John Bardan, Walter Bretan, around Christmas of 1947, discovered this thing that they will eventually call the transistor.
They know what they have. Bell Labs, AT&T goes to get patents, and then they go public with this invention. This is the paper they published in the technical literature, the Physical Review, in July of 1948. And the title of the paper was, I think, for everyone, really the tip-off as to what they had done and what they had accomplished. So this word transistor, completely new at this point. They made it up, right? Internal Bell discussion, what should we call it? Semiconductor, well, you know, that's well, hey, we need to go to the periodic table of elements and look around a little bit. But the word that was really the powerful word here is the word triode. The triode was invented by Lee DeForest in 1906, and as was discussed this morning, right? You need amplification in these industries. So the early radio industry and the long-distance industry needed a technology of amplification, make signals bigger, make them louder, make them go longer. And the triode was the great initial device to do that. Triode was instantiated in vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes were enormously successful. General purpose technology, maybe. Radio emerges. The early era of digital computers. John Atanasoff in the United States at Iowa State in roughly 1940. The great British cryptography machines, the Colossi, during World War II, and then ENIAC sort of at the edge in 1946. All of it situated in vacuum tubes. These guys say, we've built something that is a much better device that will replace the vacuum tube. That's what they saw. It will use less power. It will be less brittle. It will do all the things that the triode has done for us for decades. We're going to replace that with a superior technology. They knew they had that. Now, there's over here, it's interesting, they sort of thanked someone else, a gentleman named William Shockley, who ran the lab. Shockley is a difficult, tortured soul over time, if you know Shockley's history. Shockley was thrilled that the transistor had been invented and frustrated that he wasn't the one doing it. So Shockley sort of goes off by himself for the next month, and he invents the next transistor. So the first transistor we call the point junction transistor. The next point contact transistor, I should say. The next one is the junction transistor. That's what Shockley goes off and invents. There's a footnote here, but sort of interesting too. And they talk about the effects they've seen and found in both silicon and germanium. All of the work they're doing right now is basically in germanium. So if you have full mastery of the periodic table, as I assume everyone does, right? Germanium's sort of here and silicon's right above. I had to go look. I don't do that kind of thing. That's where they are. So they've got both of these elements, but right now they're working in germanium. 1948. This immediately gets a lot of attention. So we talked on the first panel about diffusion of technology. So this is a letter from Bell Labs in response to a letter that came in from a gentleman named Olson at Geophysical Service. Geophysical Service would eventually rename itself as Texas Instruments. They want to go into the transistor business, so they write to Bell Labs and say, look, what can you tell us? What can you send us? And they say, well, you know, it's really early stages. Go look at the Physical Review. Here's the press release. Western Electric will be back in touch eventually. But what that really meant is that Bell Labs started licensing this technology in 1951. Bell Labs had a general policy of doing lots of patent licensing. I don't know what to make of that. Regulated monopoly, they don't have the normal incentives, so I don't know what to do, but they had hundreds of licenses. Perhaps more relevantly here, they had obligations under military contracts. So they'd signed a bunch of military contracts. They were a huge military contractor. The military was effectively creating a kind of common pool in this technology through these contracts, which bound all of their contractors. So Bell Labs, this book, I have a copy of this book at the law school. This is known to the trade as the $25,000 book because you got the book plus a license to do the IP. I did not spend that much on my copy. But this book, November of 1951, and then as you go inside the book, they say, look, we're doing all of this to get the technology dispersed to aid the military effort, Korean War. So this technology is spreading long before the 1956 final judgment. There's no question that the 1949 lawsuit has been filed, right? So we're always sort of dancing in the shadows of antitrust. That's tricky, I think. But they clearly had these obligations under these military contracts to do this licensing. And they seem to do a lot of this licensing generally anyhow. A publication of the era of radio electronics says, we're studying the market. Here's what it looks like in July 1952 if you want to go buy transistors. So Western Electric is making 6,000 point contact transistors a month, selling almost all of those to the military. The military wanted this, obviously, for mobile communications, hugely valuable for that, shrinks it smaller. Raytheon's making them, RCA's making them, is ramping up, GE's making them. There are lots of companies that are making transistors. Again, this is July of 1952. This technology is spreading pursuant to the licensing and know-how transfers that Bell Lab is doing pursuant to these conferences. We have a next step forward. So there's a conference in Dayton, Ohio on transistors in May of 1954. A gentleman named Gordon Teal, who used to work at Bell Labs, has moved to TI, Texas Instruments. People in the morning of the conference say, silicon transistor, it's a few years away. Teal's talking at the end of the day. He says, I've got a few silicon transistors in my pocket. Let me demonstrate them to you. Silicon deals with heat much better than germanium does. So that's what made the silicon transistor attractive. So the next step forward, I should say the next public step, I think after the fact we know now that AT&T, actually Bell Labs, actually had some silicon transistors but had not gone public with those. But we moved from germanium to silicon. It's called Silicon Valley, not Germanium Valley, for a reason, in May of 1954. And then the Wall Street Journal has a front page story in May 1955 about the transistor, the devices it's moving into. They talk about the possibility of a Dick Tracy radio transmitter. Oh, I guess we know what that looks like. And the units here are millions of transistors being produced by roughly 18 companies. Again, this is all before the 1956 final judgment. IBM says we're going to build computers next year using transistors. Those transistors will be faster and use less power, right? So if you're watching, as I hope you are, the world of AI and chips, the chips that are rolling out week by week, right? Where everyone's chasing NVIDIA, where Google releases new chips, and Google and Apple are releasing new chips. All of those chips are about more computation and less power. That's where we were in 1955 as well. Okay, eventually we do get front page news, the AT&T settlement, right? But what I want to establish, I hope, is that comes later, right? It comes after we've created this world. Indeed, the relatively contemporary criticism of this settlement, next slide as to what it does, is that AT&T was already doing this licensing, so what kind of give is that? And yes, it blocks them from going into other businesses, but did they want to do that anyhow, right? So they had to stay in telecommunications. They also could continue to work for the military. DOD would never have blessed this deal if that hadn't been happened. So the criticism of the 56 settlement is that it sort of didn't accomplish that much given what was already in place and given what AT&T otherwise wanted to do. The next day, they did a settlement like that with IBM. So Tim was talking earlier about sort of industrial policy. Carl asked, do they have the power to do that? This is exactly what they're doing here. This is really sort of a visionary DOJ that sees that we're on the cusp of Fiona, the next, we're on the cusp of next, right? That's the electronic industry that is going to come. And they have the power to create a kind of common pool in the patents of that era. Not necessarily because they knew that when they filed the suits. The AT&T suit is filed in 49, the IBM suit in 52. But when they get there, they get to this point, and they settle to take advantage of the moment, right? So Fiona asked this question on the last panel, what about the current cases? I don't have a clue. We could do that. But what I want to say, settling those cases is not an embarrassment. right? Settling cases and changing things now, given the pace of technology. That's so important. And I think that's exactly what DOJ did at this sort of remarkable window in 1956. There is work that looks at some of this. So Nagler, Schnitzer, Watzinger have a couple of papers. There's a fourth author. I think you referenced yes, exactly. So referenced the broad paper. They have a specific paper on the technology of the transistor, and they say, look, there was a lot of licensing going on. We don't think anything happened as to the transistor with regard to the 1956 settlement. Okay, that's sort of point one. Point two, I want to go to software. So the IBM System 360, 1964, is a remarkable machine. First computer platform, I think someone said that. IBM's computers did not talk to each other, right? So they were incompatible. It's not a question of them talking with their competitors and that kind of interoperability. They didn't talk to each other. And so IBM spends a huge amount of money to try to run at a new platform. That's what the System 360 is. It's got different levels. And that turns out to be remarkably successful, okay? That's what gives rise eventually to the 1969 suit that we heard about on the last panel, 64. I want to show you three developments in software, and then our job is to try to disentangle them a little, right? That's what I want to do. So one development is, so IBM, as was mentioned, is engaging in bundling, where you get the software and the services and the hardware all together. Their mainframe competitors were doing that as well, so I don't know what to make of that. So it was not distinctively the leading firm in the industry that was doing it. Others were doing that as well. Again, that had the effect of creating a kind of common pool in software. Software is sort of a zero marginal cost good, so everyone freely sharing software, it sounds like open source. That doesn't sound terrible, right? That's the world that was getting created. But if you were outside that industry and wanted in, you had a problem. Marty Goetz said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a patent on my software. That's what I'm going to do. And when I get a patent on it, then IBM can't just scoop it up. I can propertize it. Okay, and so this is his patent, April 1968. The leading journal of the day said, full patent is issued for software. Full implications are not yet known. Yes. Had no idea, right? And software patents, if you do this kind of thing, there's a lot of criticism of them in a later era. But in this era, they start as a way to allow entrants to come into an industry where they faced the problem that the incumbent was effectively scooping up all of the innovation. They wanted to propertize that innovation. And so let's go to patents to do that. Okay, that's development one. Development two, we've heard about. So IBM is facing potential antitrust action. They know this. In December of 1968, they announced, so we're thinking about unbundling, right? So again, how do you tell, would they have done this independently? I saw a reference to the Fisher book. Yeah, the Fisher book's fantastic, right? Frank Fisher was the IBM consultant. I think he says he bought a boat. Yeah, I think he says he bought a boat off of IBM. Is that what it's called? That's fantastic. I love that. Okay. In any event, he claims, of course, that they were going to unbundle anyhow. How do you tell? The complaint very much focuses on these bundling issues. And lo and behold, right, after the suit is brought, 6 months in, they unbundle. Not a lot. So they say we're going to take down hardware prices by 3%. So I don't think the industry was thrilled by that, but they've unbundled. So Marty Goetz gets a patent. IBM unbundles. Those are two effects. And then we have a third. And the third is this. This is known in computing history circles as the $1 trillion magazine cover. I own a copy of this as well that I bought on eBay, but I have in my law school office. So we are staring at Popular Electronics for January of 1975, the Altair 8800. They call it the world's first mini computer kit. Kit should frighten you. They would send you the pieces if you wanted, and you could build it on your own as a true hobbyist would. They'd also charge a little bit more and build it. But critically, in this is an Intel microprocessor. Paul Allen sees this magazine in a bookstore in Harvard Yard, goes to his friend Bill Gates, who's a Harvard undergraduate. They've worked together on software projects back in high school in Seattle. Allen says to Gates, this is it. This is the moment. We have to move. Have to do what? Have to create a version of BASIC for the Altair. Okay? BASIC, well, BASIC was created at Dartmouth in 1964 on a General Electric computer. Okay, so there's no sort of IBM past there. So Gates and Allen set to work to create their version of BASIC, which they eventually sell for this device. On the West Coast, this magazine is being passed around at the Homebrew Computer Club. And the Homebrew Computer Club is where the young people who are interested in these kinds of devices are meeting in the Palo Alto area. And someone sees this named Steve Wozniak, and he says, I can build a better version of this. And Wozniak, then with his friend Steve Jobs, Wozniak builds the Apple I, eventually the Apple II, eventually also creates a version of BASIC for the Apple II. This is where personal computing, in some sense, starts, and starts importantly because of the effects on Gates and Allen, and then Steve Wozniak. Okay. But if you ask what actually makes the Apple II a success, and Steve Jobs is crystal clear about this, he says it's when VisiCalc was released. So VisiCalc is the first spreadsheet. This is an ad from Byte Magazine, September 1979. Jobs says, our sales just completely took off then. Finally, programming in BASIC, you got to build your own software. Yeah, okay, that's a delight for the Wozniaks of the world, but not for the rest of us. This was a program you could actually just run. Okay, so lots of people study these industries. I don't have a handle on exactly what happened, but Martin Campbell Kelly has a paper from 1995 where he looks at software revenues. Here's what he thinks happens. So he says, look, that runs from roughly 1964 through maybe 1985, he says there. You can see a couple changes in slope and then a sharp inflection point. Okay? My suggestion is, I don't know this, so we should, my suggestion is that the creation of the software industry is really driven off of the creation of the personal computer. That has basically nothing to do with the IBM unbundling. Yes, there are some slopes there and level changes. Yes, absolutely. We got to disentangle the Marty Goetz patent. But I really think it's the personal computer that drives this. I want to talk about the IBM PC. That's a great story too. So, I hope I didn't just turn that off. Nope. Okay. So IBM's watching what's happening with Apple and has to figure out what to do. You could do presentations without PowerPoint in the old days, and you did those with these very large charts. This is the presentation that Bill Lowe at IBM gave to the IBM Corporate Management Committee on August 8, 1980, to say, should we do the IBM PC? It's a pretty interesting thing to look at. So if you look at it, right at the top, you've got this question of closed versus open system. So to what extent is IBM going to open this up, and how would they do that? You see VisiCalc over there. You see Microsoft Basic. Microsoft was a languages company at this point. IBM hardware. Down in the corner, you see processor 8088. So they're going to use an Intel processor. They've got a 1-year timeline. IBM has had a poor record with smaller computers heading into this. They're not confident about their ability to execute on their own. So they sort of do this outside of the normal chain. They did have their own processor that they could have used. That's a fantastic story. So there's this whole world of RISC versus CISC processors that if you know what that means, you do, and if you don't, you don't, but you could read a book and find out. It's a great story, an important story. So they had a processor that they could have used, but they didn't. And so then the question is, what operating system is going to run it? As was said earlier, they go to Bill Gates and Paul Allen. They've already talked to them about getting computer languages. And they say, do you have an operating system? And Bill Gates says, no, you should go talk to this guy up the street. He's got an operating system, not us. Gary Kildall, CPM. There's many stories about how that particular meeting goes, but eventually they work their way back to Microsoft. And when this computer is released, it is released with 3 operating systems.
You're not going to say the thing about him being on his airplane or whatever?
Exactly. So supposedly Gary Kildall was on an airplane and flying, and there are stories like that.
Right? Okay, so Gary Kildall has a not unpublished, unfinished biography, and you can go read his story there. Okay, but in any event, make sure you see the critical point, right? IBM, as we think of it, is offering the keys of the kingdom to Gates and Allen, something that would make them billionaires, and they say no. Go somewhere else. Okay, so that world changes. But the release of the IBM PC was huge. I think all of the available evidence, and now I'm completely on the same page as Tim was, suggests that the pendency of the 69 case shaped this. So Bill Lowe, who did the chart that I showed you, he says that. Paul Allen says that in his autobiography. This is a more recent book that I know you reviewed for the New York Times. There's a quote there like that. I don't know what to make of that in the sense that, and Lowe even says that the 1956 case continued to matter. So the final judgment that was pending there. So I think the PC is opened up in a way that it would not have been absent the pendency of this antitrust case. And so when I start to work my way back to Chad's question and GPTs, if the PC opens up faster and if the PC rolls out faster, right, and antitrust matters for that, how big a deal is that for the economy? I don't know. That's not my area, but, like the last panel, I hope that it matters. Then there's a different way to run at this. So after the case is dismissed, how does IBM behave when that threat is gone and they change their behavior? So IBM buys a chunk of Intel in December of 1982. Intel's sort of in trouble at this point. Why is Intel in trouble? Why Japan won the chip race. Intel had effectively invented silicon memory, and Japan has just completely overrun that industry. A great concern that that's what's going to move will go to logic. So as was mentioned earlier, look, these are geopolitical conflicts across the course of my book, I would say, but there are 4. There's obviously the World War II era. There's the Cold War era. We do not get, I doubt we get integrated circuits at the timing we got those. That's not an antitrust issue. It is the government playing a role. If it weren't for the case that NASA and the military was willing to basically pay anything for integrated circuits, right? You get this conflict with Japan and obviously in the current era with China. IBM, freed of the antitrust decree, not the decree, but freed of the pendency of the 1969 case, makes an investment in Intel. There is something that I pulled out of a slide that I've only seen once. James Cortada has a history on IBM. He worked there for 30 years, also has a PhD in history. His claim is in 1986, Microsoft offered to sell a chunk of Microsoft IBM, and IBM said no. I don't know what to make of that. Okay. And then there's more. And the more is that as the world of clone PCs emerges, and IBM loses control over the platform that they created, and maybe felt they had to lose control over because of the pendency of the antitrust case, freed from that, they try to lock down the system. So when they roll out the PS2, it's got a micro-channel bus inside it, heavily patented. That's how they hope they're going to change the industry and shift it to that. They also try to do that with software. They've got something called OS2. And this is a press release with Microsoft and IBM in 1989. And you had to walk away from that press release thinking the future, the next, was OS2 and not this program that gets mentioned at the bottom of page 2, Windows, right? None of that played out. IBM was never able to get it back once the genie was out. And again, I think we owe that to antitrust. I have 2 minutes, and I think we're good.
I want to talk then about a different angle on these questions and what I'll call the long reach of the 1956 AT&T final judgment. So, look, we took an incredibly capable company off the table and not letting them compete in computers, right? Would they have been good at that? Subsequent history suggests no, but we can talk about that. But IBM faced less competition because of the way we quarantined AT&T. Okay. The Unix point that was made earlier, absolutely. Unix is a huge, important story. There's a lot to say about it. I do, not today, but it's absolutely an important story. The fact that Unix is sort of awkwardly situated in the 1956 final judgment clearly matters. What if we had the internet in 1980? Well, that's sort of an odd thing to say. Though the French had Minitel, right, if you know that. Sure. And we look back at Minitel and sort of giggle. But I think to the French, it was a wonder in its era. So AT&T had a device that they were calling the teleprocessor. They had a clear killer app for it, electronic yellow pages. They wanted to put that into the home. They got blocked. Newspapers didn't want them in. But they also faced the barrier of the 1956 final judgment. So again, a situation where we've taken someone off the table. We could have maybe moved forward faster. We didn't. So it's not merely observing what did happen. It's also about observing what didn't happen. I don't think we get the 1982 consent decree, a consensual deal, absent the quarantine from 1956. AT&T wanted to go into the computer business. They saw computers and communications coming together. They desperately wanted to go in to compete in that market. They didn't seem to care very much about the local operating companies. Next, the future was this combination. So to get free of that, they wanted to go in. What they didn't know, of course, is that they would get free of it and then go into that market and lose billions of dollars multiple times, right? So they turned out to be a terrible competitor in this market, right? But you don't know. How do you tell? All right, one more and then I'll stop. So as was mentioned on the last panel, the 1982 modified final judgment is amazingly silent on wireless. It's just not in the vision. But the consequence of breaking up the company into AT&T and then the 7 RBOX regional Bell operating companies means that at the point where we got to the kind of spectrum auctions that Bob was talking about in the last panel, we had more competitors present to compete in those auctions, right? Again, how does that matter? I don't know. I look at Chad. I keep saying, have I persuaded you, Chad, yet? No, okay. You don't have to say anything. But those are the kind, you want to say something? No? Not yet. Okay. Those are the kinds of things I think we need to talk about. I could do another half an hour on other subjects like the ones we're going to talk about this afternoon and others. So I think there are tons of topics to talk about in this space. I think it's a fantastic space, obviously. But with that.
I am, well, first let's thank Randy for this. And I want to mention that you went 26.9 seconds over 30 minutes. It was pretty impressive. Very impressive display for that. So let me ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it up for further discussion. So I want to kind of, I think you've been working on this book for
pre-COVID.
For a period of time.
Yeah,
which
yeah, the joy of having a job that I can do that.
Yeah, no,
we are at 320,000 words.
Okay.
Oh, yes, exactly. Now Chad wants to make faces.
So I shouldn't have called it a book. The volume. You've been working on this volume for a period. I wonder, going into it, you may have had some priors, whatever. I wonder if reading the history always makes you think that you can't say anything about anything sometimes because everything is very complicated, a lot of people. But I wonder if you can sense any way in which your views or priors you had were different, any change you experienced during the research of this book?
That's a really good question. So look, I think I had a conception that if you had a patent, that would really meant something. I don't sort of think that anymore. A patent's an opportunity to eventually bring a lawsuit to maybe get paid. Right? Obviously, there are situations where the ITC will block things at the border. But, and I don't know if it's cultural, right? So try this. Didn't say this, but let's talk about this, right? Did the 1956 settlements create a kind of culture
where people said, all right, I know you've got patents. We're going to build some stuff. We'll see what matters and doesn't matter. No one cares if you build products that don't go anywhere.
Right.
So let's go find out who's going to win, and then we'll settle up afterwards, and maybe you'll have patents. There's obviously a huge era. I've got, I think there's a patent fight that emerges between Apple and Samsung in 2012. That patent fight, I think, is hugely important, not because of the patents, but because of the fact that Samsung was a supplier to Apple. And all of a sudden, Apple's getting its chips built by Samsung. And they go, maybe we should find another company to build those chips. And that company's TSMC. And the fact that all of those fabs are along the west coast of Taiwan and 250 kilometers away from China. So there's a decision that gets made that sort of I don't know, maybe because, yeah, okay.
No, that's great. And I'm going to sort of continue that along that. Some of these events
I'm sorry, and I should say Samsung has fabs in Austin. So the whole geopolitical issue here looks very different if all of the Apple chips are getting built in Austin. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Following up on this culture question, are there times, reading the history carefully, the 50s, 60s, 70s, where you find firms behaving in a way quite different than we might expect now? Do you think, there's been cultural changes? Was stuff that was surprised you when you thought about that? You just mentioned culture.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I don't know. Look, I know that Brad Smith, who is, the current Microsoft president, I think he thinks that the Microsoft case, we're going to hear the panel next, that case changed the culture of Microsoft, right? Bill Gates says, this isn't about culture. Bill Gates says, because of that, we performed poorly in trying to build cell phones, right? I'm not sure I buy that, but that's what he says.
Although he certainly felt it. I wonder if also reading this history, remedies was discussed a big topic in the last panel. You spoke at some length about the quarantine remedy.
Yeah.
Has that at all left you thinking maybe we should think about quarantines more often? If you do it right. I was going to link it. Well, maybe I'll just ask you that.
No, go ahead.
I'm just curious if it made you think more about. I don't think quarantines are something that were particularly in fashion for, let's say, 1990 through 2016. So I just wonder if you have left you a different view of quarantines as a remedy.
So the AT&T situation is specific because of the fact that you've got these regulated and unregulated entities sort of fused together, right? And so all of a sudden you, as you know, when I've read all the books, but I assume you say in the books, right? There's obviously this concern that they're effectively subsidizing the unregulated part with the regulated part, right? So I think the vision of the quarantine there is possibly sensible in those industries. So I tried to highlight what I saw as the costs of that here. If you said, should we quarantine Apple from something? Well, they're not a regulated industry. So I think the quarantine idea is less obviously valuable there.
Well, maybe I'll push you and say, if you look back and you turn the clock back even a little, we talk about, AI as an opening and developing industry. Is there a case we should have quarantined Microsoft? If we had powers of equity that I was referring to earlier.
Yeah.
By the way, you notice in the 56th decree, there's not. Well, I know there's settlements, but there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, there's settlements, right? Yeah, exactly.
But I'm
so
saying
I
with
heard
this,
Carl's question, but just settlements.
Well, if they thought they were totally.
Of course, and there's obviously the Tuniac subsequently and all that. But
sorry,
okay.
that's a
that's
little
fine.
aside. But that I think maybe no one knew what the hell we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. That's fine.
No, but on this quarantine, in a different version of history, should we have been more aggressive in trying to quarantine Microsoft and Google, from AI? If AI is next, would that have made some sense to someone operating in 1956 and saying, let's try to keep these big they're not quite regulated monopolies, but these big guys from trying to own the next thing, or does that? Yeah. Is that one step too far?
So I gave chapter 19 in the book 2 weeks ago today at the law school. Part of that chapter is a litany of Microsoft failures, right? I mean, it's just extraordinary. This is a company we should be scared about? Their position on the desktop has remained largely unchanged, right? That would be true of IBM with regard to mainframes. But they do a terrible job in their actual market, so Vista's terrible, and Windows 8 was imaginative and a failure. They completely fail in the smartphone market. They've got their own software there by Nokia, billions, all down the drain. right? And so look, there's this sort of the Steve Ballmer era is a dark era for Microsoft. And it's only when Nadella takes over that all of a sudden things start to change. But if you look at their market cap, it just is basically flat until 2015. So would you have said who would have thought Microsoft mattered even?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a good period for the Seattle Seahawks, so maybe that's related
Well,
somehow.
and he obviously buys the Clippers. So it all worked out nicely for
Yeah.
Steve.
No, there's a way in which Microsoft in that period does almost feel like a trust fund person who can, has this guaranteed income and
Yes,
can
absolutely.
do anything.
And even, but trying. I my vision of the trust, I shouldn't say this. My vision of trust fund people is they don't do anything, right? Microsoft is trying desperately and failing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, no, let me double down on the point. I agree that maybe Microsoft's not scary, but the sense that you'd have a
And Bing.
maybe talk
I
about
didn't
Google.
mention Bing.
Let me talk
How
about
could I
Google.
not mention Bing?
Let me talk about Google then.
Yeah, let's go to Google.
If you talk about quarantines, a big case. If DOJ said, listen, Google, you're going to lose, but we'll offer you a settlement, which is you stay out of AI. You agree to divest all your AI stuff, and we'll let you go for all these cases. Do you think that would be a good one for the country?
So a couple things on that. Look, the most natural settlement of the Google case at some level, because the heart of that case, as people almost certainly know, is this deal between Google and Apple, right? So that Google is the default on iOS. So, and as we'll hear tomorrow morning, Europe has now got the DMA, and the DMA means that when you turn on a new device, you face these 3 choice screens. The natural solution, as it were, into the Apple case is to say, okay, Google, you can't pay Apple any money, and we're going to set up a choice screen for search. Yes, exactly. Do you think that matters in the slightest?
I would say
The
the
answer
deal
is
is
no.
right.
The answer is no, right? I'm playing, but that has to be no.
I mean, I don't like remedies where the ultimate result is consumers or people click on more stuff. It's a little bit of a slam on.
Even Europe had limits.
No, but
right?
you're kind of not answering my question, which is to say.
Well, no, I am. I think. Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, that doesn't sound like a good remedy to me either. I'm asking, would it be a better remedy?
I'll say no. So I'll say no. I'm happy to answer your question. I'll say no.
We trade all of our cases, also the ad tech case. We'll trade all these cases. You can have the markets of the past. I'm drawing on Fiona's stuff a little bit here. Grand deal. You get all the markets of the past. You can continue your search advertising monopoly.
Yeah.
But divest all your AI stuff, create another competitor,
Right.
And you stay back there and let the next.
So great. So
crowd
tell me what you're trying to accomplish there. So what I would worry about is that we're taking a terrific firm off the table and creating the next thing.
We're trying
What we should worry about is, this is I think part of the discussion, is whether they have something in their incumbent position which lets them, this is your adjacent market or next, distort that next competition, right? That we should worry about. But I'm not hearing the linkage between necessarily Google's current position and that distortion.
Well, I'm trying to recreate the 56 consent decree, which you
No, I know.
prized.
I know.
And I guess what we're.
But they had a vision there. That vision there was driven by the fact that we had a regulated and unregulated businesses. We would have had they gone into computers fused together, and the government didn't know how to regulate.
Well, maybe we replace the word regulated with we have a dependable monopoly and we can do all this other stuff. I mean, it might have been a favor to Microsoft if, frankly, they had been quarantined out of everything. You know what I mean?
Stop us before we buy Nokia.
Yeah, or something like that.
I get it.
Yeah,
I completely get it.
And had been quarantined out of everything. It's a vision that says. Similarly, 56 AT&T was a very impressive company. We didn't let them get into what was obviously a promising market.
Yes.
Where they wanted the difference maybe was Google. So that you're going to take that loss, and I'm arguing maybe that would be a good.
Yeah.
Right.
I
you think they're good?
I think we can talk about how they're doing. That's a different discussion.
Yeah.
And obviously all the image problems that Gemini's had, but push that to one side.
Oh, by the way, we're allowed to go. We're going to leave time for audience questions. We're going to go 10 minutes over with the permission of the. We discussed this earlier.
You're watching the clock.
Yeah, I'm watching the clock.
Okay.
So, one, although I suddenly forgot my.
That was
I
my
have another
move.
question. Do you find when you studied the, you spoke highly of the Antitrust, the Justice Department in the 50s, which seemed to have much more of an industrial policy, kind of like they realized things were going and they were thinking.
I think that's what they did.
Yeah, and
Boldly.
and we're bold. Does that it's kind of a pointed question. What do you think was different about that Justice Department, and were they in kind of contemporary language thinking more about ecosystems as opposed to markets? What was different about the way you think they were thinking back then?
Okay, so but I want to take a step forward in the
Yes.
sense that, so Giovanna has one in her piece that I think people don't pay enough attention. She wrote a piece on the pro-market. You should go to pro-market, right? Mentioning the FTC's settlement with Intel regarding the GPU. And that's 2010, I guess. I have a chunk of this in a chapter. I think the FTC gets a lot of credit for recognizing, it goes exactly to what we were just talking about, that Intel was in a posture where they could affect competition in this new adjacent market and distort it. And the FTC sort of jumps in, I think, and this is Bill Kovacic, I think, in a very smart and sophisticated way and sort of controls that. Kudos to them.
Right.
I don't think that was obvious.
So in a way I'm asking, what is your advice for enforcers and the brain trusts at Justice
I
and
do.
FTC? Not specific, but how should they be thinking?
Exactly.
How should they be thinking?
Bring the cases, settle the cases, focus on the next.
Okay. Let's open the audience questions.
Yeah.
Let's see. Go ahead, since you were mentioned. Yeah.
I don't want this to be any more about my question than it has to be.
And you are at risk if you ask another question now. That could be the next 5 years. So, yeah, okay. They want to give you a microphone, Chad.
Well, it was all preface anyway. Thank you. I mean, the hard thing for really answering that kind of question, forget my specific, is what's the counterfactual? Okay. You know more about the market that you just walked through than anybody. Even there, it's hard to do. What's the equilibrium that would happen in there? Okay. Is it useful to do polar cases as counterfactuals instead? Forget about what the most likely outcome is. Just what's the worst case, conditioning on technology and the politics. What was the most anti-competitive possible outcome, and what was the most competitive possible outcome? Not likely to happen, but just could have happened. Just bound the thing. This is as good as it could have been. This is as bad as it could have been. And it's going to be in the middle somewhere. Is that useful? And do you have any sense of what either of those scenarios look like? Thank you.
Can you say something about that?
Oh, no, I think it was a question for...
Okay, I'm happy,
yeah.
but I mean...
Yeah.
Okay. So look, I think I think there are situations. So look, we briefly were going to break up Microsoft, right? What would that have done? What would have been the consequences of that? That's a pretty interesting question, right? I don't know if that quite goes to polar and bounding, but I think it's in that spirit, right? And we chose not to do that. And what we did was, well, I don't want to say anything. We're going to hear from the people next, right? So I'm really curious to see what they're going to say. So,
I'll repeat my point. First, that could be very helpful. I also think a form of counterfactual is other countries and other industries where we didn't do anything. And what they look like. And all this is complicated. These are all imperfect methods.
But yes, I agree. But and you want to go look at these other industries. God love you. I would too if I had the time. So I don't mean it that way at all. Yeah. It's more that the kinds of industries that we've been talking about. So again, Giovanna was talking about the IBM case in Europe, right? Yeah. So these are worldwide industries. Yeah. So
that's true.
Yeah. Okay.
Matt, go ahead.
Thank you. And 330,000 words. I'm
only 320.
320. Oh,
okay. I have one more chapter to write.
And at that, my heart goes out to you for what
me too.
The editing process. So a couple of questions about how executives thought in the 50s, 60s, maybe 70s. So did AT&T and IBM, did they buy a lot of companies in that time? Were they serial acquirers? Because big tech companies today are just constantly buying. And that's actually just pervasive in corporate America today. And then the other thing is, how often kind of in your encounters in the archives were these executives talking about their stock price?
So I don't know the answer to the latter. So I assume much less, but I don't know that. On the first question, which is the purchases, and I assume you can talk about the 18th. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think IBM did very much of that. So when they bought Lotus in 1995, if that date's right, I don't know, that was seen as a huge deal, and it was a hostile takeover. So in a later era where IBM is struggling, and I talked about the Steve Ballmer years, At IBM, it's probably the Ginny Rometty years, where the company just doesn't make progress. They start buying things as they desperately look for a strategy. But core classic IBM, I don't think that was part of what they did.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like it's when you read these histories, and particularly the 80s when IBM has kind of a dominance PC, and there's all this kind of new challenges. There's all these moves that would seem incredibly obvious in the 2010s period, which is like you should buy all these guys. They seem so obvious. There's all this talent out there. Why don't you buy all these guys? This guy Bill Gates looks dangerous. You buy it. Like, why don't you own him? And Bill Gates, I said,
I know. That's why I heard that. I was
I
paying
was talking
attention.
to him. Yeah, I talked to him once, and he was like, he thought we were sure it was going to crush us, or they just they don't do it. And partially maybe that's that antitrust paranoia, but also maybe this idea that you buy your way out of every problem was a consequence of non-enforcement of merger law for a period of time, or kind of relative non-enforcement against tech. So I think that might have had to do it, such that Mark Zuckerberg openly talks about buying, Instagram because, they could become a dangerous competitor. We got to get rid of them.
I teach those emails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matt,
can I just rephrase my second question? Because I think
the stock one.
The stock one. Which
I'll rephrase
it so you don't have to avoid it. You can avoid it a different way.
That's fine.
So when AT&T, I was really struck when AT&T had those military contracts and
yes.
We're doing this to help the Korean War. What were the executives focused on, right? They were today they're focused on market capitalization, increasing that. What was the goal? Were they just like, oh, let's help them win the war? Was it increasing revenues, increasing profits, better? Like, what was the lodestar for them?
So I don't know. I mean, look, I heard what Richard was saying about the AT&T archives. I've done 3 archive trips. I'm not a historian, just so we're clear. I'm a lawyer and economist, but I have done 3 archive trips. And I have to say, going to archives is absolutely addicting. So, I mean, really, that would be like, spend your summer vacation. It's just so fantastic. It's like time travel. But I have not done that for AT&T. Do you know, Richard, do you know the answer to that? No. Okay.
What were they thinking?
It's a good question.
I don't think Randy's avoiding the question. I think he genuinely is admitting he doesn't know the answer. Aaron, public choice Aaron.
So something I've heard as a recurring theme, both if you're talking or talks, is the emphasis on the ability to have access to use the technology by other businesses. So I'm really curious how much, when we talk about antitrust and technology and technological development, are we really talking about antitrust billing out the U.S. patent system? And then just to give you a side note, you'd mentioned patent fights. In the 19th century, there's a really big patent fight over telegraph technology to the point where companies are forced to go out of business because their patents are rude and eligible. So I'll tell you more about that later. But the key thing I want to talk about, though, is when we talk about antitrust and technology, are we really talking about the antitrust system being used to bail out the U.S. patent system and not being necessarily being efficient doing its job?
I guess I keep saying things I don't know. So I'm not a patent expert either. So I guess I'm skeptical about that, right? So I think the patent system, again, Tim asked up front, what was I surprised by? I thought a patent, I owned it, you can't use it. No, they all use them. So, and I don't know, I've not seen a discussion, for example, of the AT&T era and saying, oh, there were lots of junky patents that AT&T had. Bell Labs is seen, I think, completely correctly as a wonder, right? Really fundamental inventions. This era that we live in today, where I've got a figure like this at some point, where Google starts buying patents to sort of have a defensive trove, they say that their devices, the smartphone, implicates 250,000 patents. How is that possible? That doesn't sound to me, as an outsider, like a well-functioning patent system. Yeah.
I mean, it does strike me that if someone said, I know the solution to all of these cases will force Google and Facebook to license all their patents, and people would be like, what's that going to do? So anyway, other question. I feel like I don't have
clearly right.
Filippo. You have a question, Filippo, or
please.
you're calling us sometime? No. You have a
Here's a question. I don't know when we're done.
Oh, you're waiting for the mic. I see.
So how do you think about this broader competitive world, right? So you're in a world in the 50s, and it's like an equilibrium effect, of course, but there are just a lot more companies in a way, like a lot of more military suppliers probably, a lot of smaller companies. And a lot of what you describe is just people jumping firms and starting a new firm, which is something that you could do, I guess, in the absence of non-competes in California, which is becoming less and less common as companies go to other places. So how do you think about this broader competitive ecosystem enabling the type of innovation in the absence of antitrust interventions versus today where markets are much more concentrated and there's just less places to go to if you want, or more ways to block you from moving around?
Well, I do want to say, look, I think this is, I say this in the text, but I mean, I think that the creation of this common pool of patents effectively facilitates employees exiting firms, right? They know that they can go to this place and use this technology. And so when Texas Instruments hires Gordon Teal, I don't know, he knows how to pull the germanium to make the things, to make the chips. And he knew that he wasn't going to face some sort of claim from AT&T with regard to that. And so, and what you're doing there is you are decentralizing the decision makers for the technology, right? The idea that AT&T had the silicon transistor and sort of, not for a long time, 6 months, maybe 4 months, we're sitting on it, and all of a sudden TI's got it. How long would they have sat on it? I don't know. And the fact that Teal was able to exit, I think, clearly facilitates that.
Yeah. Can I ask another question connected to that, connected to what Richard said? And how does the antitrust settlement solidify a belief that the companies can grow? So they actually can hire people, they get more money.
Yeah.
Because now you basically took the company away from the market in a way that before you were just being afraid of, you're just afraid of being squashed.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Giovanna, again, mentions in this piece Gordon Moore, right? And Gordon Moore is one of the people who starts at Shockley Semiconductor. And Shockley was a terrible manager. And so there's a group that exits, the Traitorous Eight, as they're known in the field, and they form Fairchild. And Gordon Moore says, wow, the 56 consent to final judgment, we knew we could rely on that. Now, this goes a little bit to Chad and counterfactuals. No one asked him, yes, exactly, is did you know that if you'd started 2 years ago, AT&T was giving out all these licenses? Well, he doesn't pay any attention to that. Why would he, right? So I think that's what's hard to figure out.
Randy, can I come? Laura, go ahead.
Sorry, you could have driven me crazy all day. Everyone has been.
Microphone.
Laura, I think one of the few computer scientists in the room.
Oh God,
I'll add.
This scares me.
Okay, good.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'm not gonna press you on anything too crazy. It's something that has been driving me nuts all day. Is everyone has been absolutely correctly talking about the wonder that was Bell Labs.
Oh, okay.
And as a computer scientist, right, like, boy, do I feel that.
Good.
It was. But the thing that I am painfully aware of is, so virtually all post-copper signal transmission technology was invented in Bell Labs. Coaxial transmission.
Yeah.
The technology for fiber optic. Microwave technology.
Yes.
Cellular technology. All of it. Satellites. Do you know the idea for satellites came from a Bell Labs engineer who then never did anything with it?
Didn't know that.
They didn't build any of this stuff. They built a demo of coax transmission and then never built production lines. They built a demonstration microwave line and then they never built any. MCI built the first one. The first cellular network was built in Japan. So, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me, the reason we got all of this stuff in a burst. Once the antitrust cases against AT&T, both the private and the DOJ case began stacking up. That's when we got all this stuff that had been invented in some cases many decades before. So
that's a Tim Book question, I think.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So I'm just wondering, in this framework you're talking about settle and move on to the next.
Yeah.
Is that really going to be a deterrent that is going to get us is going to get all of this technology off the shelf?
You want to run first and I'll run second? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, the only thing I'm worried about I agree with 2/3 of what you say in your pithy thing, but with settlement, just the danger of the wimpy settlement is so obvious to me. You have this 56, which is that was not a wimpy settlement. But
hard
you
to
know, I
tell.
also worked at the FTC in the 2010s, and boy, we settled some stuff for like, you know, a penny on the dollar, and let all this stuff kind of go. And everybody gets to declare victory and talk about how great they did and pat you on the back and, you know, have drinks and so on, and then go on to jobs with the guys you settle with. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that risk of wimpy settlement strikes me as so serious, and I don't know how structurally how we do it, but I hear about they're faster. But anyway.
In a world in which the technology just goes and goes and goes.
Yeah, but I agree with this cul-de-sac. That another one that the answering machine was in working form in like 1934 or something, and obviously we reached consumers in 1980. So that seems like Richard seems like he's dying. I know we're just out of time, but
if we're out of time, we should stop.
Richard, why don't you say one thing as long as it's not too long? Yeah.
Issue was enormously important for electrical manufacturers in the 1880s. Harold He's one of the few historians to work with Schumpeter. Chandler was always startled by that because it didn't fit Chandler's story, but he taught that book. It's very important in independent Bell struggle, and it's a daily question in the press. And of course, the dial-up ends up with the independents and then not with the Bell. The question of, so it remains important even after Bell Labs in 25, the question about magnetic recording and the answering machine, you know, Bell, one of the arguments come up recently is that Bell was aware that an awful lot of telephone calls were about illicit matters, and they didn't want to push something.
Yeah, obscenity on the was one reason.
Or gambling, or And then the Radio Act of 27 is basically a patent settlement. So I wouldn't want anyone to come out of here thinking that patents were not absolutely central to the business strategy of high-tech firms, going back to landline telegraph. The telegraph industry was organized around patents.
Yeah.
In fact,
right.
You know, it goes back to 1830. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, well, that's helpful. And look, why don't you join us again? I hope you keep the whole book at its full length. I think it'd be fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.